require employees and customers to show proof of vaccination? How big of an impact would that have?
It would have a big impact. We have tried to avoid the P word and the M word, which are vaccine passports and vaccine mandates. And what did we see during Delta? That we didn't get to the goals that we needed to be at with vaccination. We only reached that 70% yesterday, which is a month later than we wanted for first dose. And this is now the conversation. It's passports, it's requirements, and everyone is so tired of the pandemic that you will see that places like businesses can have a huge impact by saying, hey, you can't come in here unless you're back.
I also want to ask you about testing, because there are a lot of questions as we see more of these breakthrough cases, people who are testing positive, who may be asymptomatic. What is being done right now with testing, and what do you think needs to change?
The problem is we're using the same testing paradigms that we did before vaccination, after vaccination. So what do I mean by that? If you are asymptomatic and you test for whatever reason, though right now that's not what the CDC is recommending, you could have a very little amount of virus in your nose and you will still positive and you will have to quarantine. So the problem with all of this is that if we test people and not somehow account for their level of infectiousness, you've just proven that someone's asymptomatic and they're not infectious. And that's actually not a vaccine failure, that's a vaccine success. And so turning to antigen testing as opposed to PCR testing, or incorporating what we call the CT value of the PCR test, would help us decide who needs to be isolated and who doesn't. We can't act like we were before vaccination, where any positive test meant you had to isolate.
Can we do that on a large scale? Because even before vaccination, right, I had COVID, and long after I was no longer sick and I wasn't at risk of getting anyone else sick, I was testing positive because I had the virus in me.
That's exactly right. The problem is if we don't do this on a large scale, and you're right, it's a great question. Can we do this on a large scale? The best way to do it is with rapid antigen testing, because that will not tell you if you have a low viral load. It has to trigger when you have a high enough viral load that you could be infectious. And if we're going to use the PCR test, we have to incorporate cycle threshold. I know your point is good. Can we do it on a large scale? We can if we want. Any PCR test has to tell you how many cycles it has to go through before it triggers a positive. If we don't shift to that, a lot of people are going to be sitting at home, especially during Delta, when it's so transmissible, and a teeny bit could be in your nose, and people are going to be sitting home when they don't need to be. So if we don't change our testing paradigm,
Then given that, right, the CDC now says the Delta variant is more transmissible among vaccinated people than we previously thought. Bottom line, who should be getting tested and who shouldn't?
Okay, so people who are asymptomatic and vaccinated still do not need to be tested, and I agree with that. If they're going to do that, then we need to incorporate these values. If you're symptomatic and vaccinated, you should get tested, even if you have mild symptoms. Because even though we are seeing more mild breakthrough infections, you're likely to be a little infectious, probably not as infectious as if you are unvaccinated, though. We can't take the Provincetown example and extrapolate from that. That was a very unique circumstance and probably not generalizable. But if you have symptoms, you're likely to be infectious, so we do need to test if you're symptomatic and infectious, and to see if you're infectious.